Hello again, ladies and gentlemen of the interwebs. Hope you are well. I'm going to jump straight into this, so turn off the lights, take a deep breath and relax, as they say. And this is my hypothesis. I believe it is feasible to locate human beings anywhere on the planet by utilising the natural electromagnetic radio waves that are broadcast from our human DNA. This is possible with instruments using either passive or active radio waves of different frequencies and energies. This same mechanism could also be employed to locate a specific person based on their unique DNA. This technique may also be used to determine a person's health, mood, metabolism, mindset, and intent. This hypothesis may also explain the phenomenon of knowing when you are being watched, followed, or tracked by others, or knowing or having a feeling that someone is about to phone or message you. This hypothesis may also explain how tracking in cadaver dogs operates, including how wolves sense territorial incursions from a rival wolf pack from a distance of up to 25 miles or more. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, or go to grahamfrench247.com/donate. I do appreciate your support. So the question is, how can you be found? And I believe it's not a case of who you are, but more of a case of what you are. And it's not just humans. I believe any life source on this planet can be found and tracked in real time. What I'm going to do, I'm going to present this in several different segments. And the first segment is going to be the how. How do we do this? The second segment is going to be the what. What is it we're actually looking for? And then we're going to come on to the exciting bit. We're going to stitch those two bits together and show you actually what is possible, how we can possibly find not just any body, but anything that has DNA within it. And that includes not just animals, but plants as well. And that might sound really odd at this end of the vlog, but stick with it because, and I would actually recommend you listen to all of it. What I am going to do is in the show notes, I'm going to put some timestamps in there. So you can just jump forward to the interesting bits that you're interested in. You might just want to go to the very end, which I tell you how you do, like to wrap it all up, how the whole thing actually works. But if you want to impress people, you know, if you want to impress people at work or if you're in the next dinner party, whenever that's going to be in a lockdown, then just stick with it because I'm going to explain this in very simplistic terms that the man or the woman in the street can actually sort of not just understand, but explain to their fellow human. This to me, I mean, I thought of this a while ago, and I tell you how it started. I was listening to David Paulides, and he's a former detective in America, and he looks into these unusual missing persons cases. And I'm not going to go into it now, but at the tail end of this, I'll explain as to how I came about it. But he posed one question a few weeks back, and he said, there's certain groups of people with certain dynamics or certain characteristics go missing in clusters, sometimes at the same time. And he said, well, he posed the question, how can it possibly be that these people are going missing? What is it about these people that, you know, they seem to be just, I mean, it's I'm going to stick some links to it, but you've got to listen to these David Paulides vlogs. It's really highly unusual about these people that go missing, and there's hundreds, actually there's thousands of people go missing under highly unusual circumstances. And he posed the question, how are these people being found? Because they do have certain characteristics, whether they have Germanic heritage, whether they have certain IQ levels, they might have certain disabilities or certain abilities, they might have certain skills. And that got me thinking into, if I wanted to find a certain person with a certain skill level or certain characteristics, and these people had nothing electronic about them, how would I do it? And after a couple of days, excuse me, after a couple of days of, you know, I don't really think about it, I just let me subconscious sort of like cogitate, if you like. It came back with this, and I had a hypothesis, and I thought, right, I'm now going to go and do some digging, some research into, is this hypothesis true? And what you're about to listen to are the results of my research into this hypothesis. So pose yourself this question. You want to find a certain person that could be of a certain height, a certain eye colour, a certain heritage, whether it's Germanic or English or French or Italian. How would you find that person? I think this is going to be really, really interesting, because when I first discovered this, and I've read through quite a lot of literature, it didn't just prove my hypothesis, it actually blew my mind, because I thought to myself, right, I'm going to explain in a moment how I came across this or what it's actually contained. But the actual ramifications further down the line, which is going to be in the next episode of, okay, I've explained the basics, now let's take it to the next level. But this is the most exciting part of it, what you're about to listen to. So, ladies and gentlemen, make sure your seatbelt is fastened, ensure that your tray and your seat are back in its upright position because it's just about to land this sucker. In order for you to be able to be discovered, there has to be a method and a way of finding where you or anybody else is on the planet. And I believe that to be via an electromagnetic field that every single human being produces just by the method of electricity running through your body. And this is your own electricity, because really humans are just sort of like meat bags full of salt water, like an electrolyte, and that's essentially what we are. And the electricity that runs through our body is created by our cells, by our own cells within the body. If you move your muscles, when you're breathing, when you're thinking, that's all uses electricity, which is generated within. So we're just sort of like a biological method of creating electricity. Pretty much what the Matrix, the film The Matrix, that was based on the fact that humans were just sort of like batteries as a power source. So this is the guy who's written this article. He's a guy called Jack Fraser. He's got a master in physics, and he's at the University of Oxford, quite a prestigious establishment. So he asked the question: is it possible for the human being to create an electromagnetic field? So in his example, he's going to give you the example of someone punching you in the face, and why does that hurt? So he's going to say, I want you to imagine him punching you in the face, in the nose, and did it hurt? Well, it probably did, but why does it hurt? It's because his fist connected rather quickly with your face, and that's the sort of be-all and end-all of it. But our bodies are made up of cells, and this is what it means to connect or touch, which cells are made up of atoms, and atoms are mostly made up of empty space. So everything you see around you that's solid, that at the cellular level is mostly made up of space. So an atom is a centralized region of extreme density and a positive charge, which is called the nucleus, and it's surrounded by a region of probability waves which describe the wave function of the electron. So we're now looking these days in science, it's now really classed as a sort of like fuzzy ball of charges. And this is, it's not like the planetary orbital model, which is what I was taught about when I was at school. And they said the electrons sort of orbit the nucleus, almost how the Earth orbits the sun. And that's not really true anymore. That model went out years ago, and it says here that the model, which is the one of the planetary where the Earth orbits the sun, the electron orbits the nucleus, that's not really true. It's that was called the Bohr model of the atom, which was superseded in 1925 by the Schrödinger model. And in decades later, quite a few decades later, I was taught the Bohr model. So I was being told something that wasn't true. So how can you be punched in the face if your face and the hand punching you in the face are basically just made up of fuzzy balls? So, because at the atomic level, there's no concept of solid. So you would think that your hand would go through your face and you'd fall through the floor and you'd fall through the seat if you're trying to sit down. But the answer lies in the electric field. Every single atom has its own electric field. And when you put the two atoms close together, they mess around with each other, with each other's electric field. And it's basically interference. So in some circumstances, this messing around is what leads to atomic bonding, where atoms join together. So where the atoms and electrons find a way to coexist in a way that minimises their mutual energy and they resist being pulled apart. Pretty much where hydrogen with oxygen turns into water, your H2O. Very strong atomic bond. But sometimes they just bounce off each other. The two electron fields repel each other and the atoms go flying apart. So what you experience when my fist connects with your nose is actually the electrons in my fist repelling those in your nose. That's quite a painful way. This repulsion obviously then causes a chain reaction with all the other atoms in your face, which are then mutually interacting with each other. And they all repel in unison from my fist. And that's why your nose doesn't atomize into trillions of atoms. So specialized sections of your body then generate electrical signals which are fired along other specialized sections of your body, into a really specialised section of your body, which results in a cascade of electrical signals being transmitted through the entire unit. So everything that happens in your body regarding pain or muscles moving or your brain synapses firing, that's all electricity. So in other words, the sensors in your nose send a message along the nerves into your brain, which is then processed as pain. It's the same when you're listening. It's your eardrum vibrates, and that turns it into electrical information, which your brain then interprets as sound. Everything that just happened when you get smacked in the face was because of the electrical fields in our bodies. Everything you just experienced occurred because we're both surrounded by our own personal force field. That's one way of thinking about it. And the insides of our bodies contain electrical generators, which they use to send signals throughout our body. So your brain tells your hand to move, move your hand up, move your hand down, wave at someone. That's all electrical signals sent from your brain through your central nervous system to the muscles in your arm and your hand to wave at somebody. Virtually every single process which is keeping you alive can be traced back to an electrical field which some component of your body is creating. Even as he's typing this, the only thing letting him do it is the electrical field in his fingers, depressing the keys on the laptop, and the only thing stopping falling through the chair is his body's specialised horse field. That's quite funny, which is repelling the chair. Yeah, his eyes are intercepting the electromagnetic radiation. And let's not even get started on the fact I am constantly outputting a low-level radiation field in the infrared region. Yep, that is true. And turning that into yet more electrical signals. So it's sort of like your body's just sort of like a meat sack full of electrolyte, salt water, which then assists the electrical stuff moving through your body. So everybody is just really a human battery. Yeah, unusual, isn't it? So his eyes are intercepting electromagnetic radiation. Not only is it possible that the human body creates electromagnetic fields, it is the only way you can possibly exist as a coherent entity. You are an electric field, a giant one, which holds your atoms together. So, which uses other electric fields to talk to other bits of yourself. So again, stuff that gets around your body is all via electricity. So there you have it. Here's a guy who's a master of physics telling you that you create your own electromagnetic field. So what does that look like? Let's have a look. This is an image I've got from the internet, and it really does demonstrate, I think, what the energy field or the electromagnetic field looks like around your body. It looks very much like a torus or an apple shape, and if that reminds you of something, here is what I think it would remind you of, which is the same torus or apple shape that you would see around the planet. This is Earth's very own electromagnetic field. The problem is, though, how do you find a single person out of this cacophony of electromagnetic fields, almost 8 billion people around the planet? Well, I think I've also got an answer for that as well. There are some medical papers that I've read recently, and I'm going to go through one or two of them, that show that the DNA can act as an antenna which doesn't just receive, but can also transmit a sort of like transceiver, your DNA transceiver. So let's have a look at a few of those papers that actually talk about how this is done. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to ease you in gently with this first article, and really it talks about the DNA is a fractal antenna in an electromagnetic field, and I'll come on to what a fractal antenna is in a moment, but let's just have a quick read through this. And this is just the abstract I want to talk about. All of these articles I'll be showing you, I'll be putting the links for them in the show notes. So if you want to go and have a read about it later, more in depth, and I would advise you to do that if you're interested in this sort of thing, then I'm going to leave the links for them. But let's have a look at this first. So in abstract, DNA is a fractal antenna in electromagnetic fields, and I want to just really jump down into what it's looking at. So it basically says in this paper that we examined published reports of increased stress protein levels and DNA strand breaks due to EMF interactions, both of which are indicative of DNA damage. We also considered antenna properties such as electronic conduction within DNA and its compact structure in the nucleus. The results are EMF interactions with DNA are similar over a range of non-ionizing frequencies, i.e. extremely low frequency, remember that bit, and radio frequency ranges. There are similar effects in the ionizing range, but the reactions are more complex. And it's really the ELF, the extremely low frequency, which I'll come on to later, why that's important. So the wide frequency range of interaction with EMF is a functional characteristic of a fractal antenna, and DNA appears to possess the two structural characteristics of fractal antennas: electronic conduction and self-symmetry. These properties contribute to greater reactivity of DNA with EMF in the environment, and the DNA damage could account for increases in cancer epidemiology, as well as variations in the rate of chemical evolution in early geologic history. So what does that mean? That basically means that you have an antenna that is the shape of a fractal, and I'll show you an example of that in a second, but whatever that shape is, it's actually a mirror image, and this is on receive only. So in the extreme low frequency and the radio frequency ranges of the electromagnetic spectrum, it's the very low end at which your DNA seems to be acting. Again, this is a receiver, but also it can, as I'll show you in a second, actually transmit as well. And a typical example of a fractal geometric design, which is what we're talking about here, is a snowflake. And there's there's an untold number of fractal designs and fractal geometric images in nature, and a snowflake is just one of them. This next paper we are going to be looking at is called Radio Signals from the DNA, a Philosophical Issue. Again, this will be available as a link in the show notes below. And let's have a quick read through it. The bits I want to read are in yellow, highlighted in yellow, and I won't be discussing all of it because it's quite a long document, quite involved in some of the elements and some of the subject matter in this paper. I'm going to be discussing in yet another vlog later on down the line. So let's quickly go through it. This paper discusses the nature of electromagnetic radio signals and summarises the advances in optogenetics and radiogenetics that have found a substantial number of genes in both humans and other species that can be activated by electromagnetic signals ranging from extremely low frequency radio waves through to infrared radio waves, as well as visible light and ultraviolet tremendously high frequency THF radio waves, and that's right at the top end of the radio scale. So let's go down to the introduction. And this is, for me, when I first read this introduction, I had to read it several times because the first line is, it has been known since the early 1970s that the DNA is emitting electromagnetic radiation, but what is not appreciated is that this AMR is in the nature of radio signals. And I had to read that several times. I was like, whoa, steady on, what? So you are basically emitting you've got this electromagnetic field around you, and because you've got that electromagnetic field around you, you are emitting electromagnetic radiation. So basically every species, every plant is effectively a walking transmitting antenna. It's quite remarkable. And this notwithstanding the fact that the burgeoning new field called optogenetics is uncovering more and more genes that are responsive to EMR and more proteins, especially in the neurons of the brain, that are actually synthesized from the DNA and are likewise responsive to EMR. In this paper, I will review the pioneering work of Fritz Albert Popp, who was first to popularize the notion that DNA absorbs and emits light, and demonstrate how this has mushroomed into a whole new field of study called optogenetics. I then discuss in general terms the basic principles of radio transmission and electronics, and finally I attempt to demonstrate there is a plethora of evidence in the mainstream literature that the molecular structure and electrical activity in the DNA is such as to make the DNA as a classic radio transmitter. And that just blew my mind when I found out. So we are all walking radio receivers and radio transmitters. And we're going to find very soon as what you express as a radio transmission is going to surprise you. And once we've finished this paper, your views on how we are discoverable around the planet will probably change. So let's continue. As we scroll down to the next highlighted piece. Again, this is quite a long document. I'm probably going to read less than 20% of it. There is a vast amount of research data about genes being activated by electromagnetic radiation. For instance, keying in the search words genes activated by infrared light into Google Scholar will produce hundreds of results. Below is an abstract from one paper that was chosen at random and was around number 220 in the list of results. You will get a similar list of results if you search for genes activated by UV light and genes activated by low frequency radio waves. So what that really means, ladies and gentlemen of the interwebs, is that you can switch on or off genes by either infrared light or extremely low frequency radio waves. When I say you, what I really mean is other people. Again, we're going to scroll down. There's lots and lots of information I'm going to be picking up at a later date. In 2010, a group of researchers, which included Nobel laureate Dr. Luc Montagnier, wrote a paper entitled DNA Waves in Water, which reports that the DNA changes the molecular structure of the water. Essentially, the research found that DNA emits an ultra-low frequency electromagnetic signal that can be stored and transmitted in pure water, and that if you introduce the ingredients necessary for synthesizing the DNA by the polymerase chain reaction, PCR, nucleotides, primers and polymerase, to the tube with the pure water that had gained the AM signal, then the original DNA sequence would be recreated. Let's just go through that a little bit again. So what this is essentially saying is that DNA can be remembered in water, and then if you introduce the ingredients for that DNA, the water would remember it and it would recreate the original DNA as transmitted by the DNA. And that's via a radio signal. You wouldn't actually have to put any DNA in the water. The water would remember the DNA structure, and as long as you had the ingredients in there for the DNA, which is nucleotides, primers and polymerase, it would remember and recreate that DNA. It's quite remarkable. Most of the discussion in the paper centres around how the nanostructures in the water can retain the information from the DNA in form of memory, but the essential point is the fact that the information about the original sequence of the DNA was emitted by the DNA as an electromagnetic field. These ultra-low frequency radio waves that contain the information. So you are continuously emitting via ultra-low frequency radio waves your DNA. You're pushing it out 24/7. The fact that it is precisely pure water that has this capacity to transmit the signal from the DNA and to retain the integrity of the signal in memory will not come as a surprise when it's remembered that about 65% of the composition of our bodies is water. In other words, it is reasonable to assume that this is a normal metabolic process that is naturally occurring in all creatures containing DNA, including plants. So every single species, every single plant, every single animal that has DNA within it is automatically transmitting at an ultra-low frequency a copy of their DNA as a radio signal. Yes, I know, I've just left a minute's pause there just for you to actually absorb that. We are all transmitting a copy, well, we're not a copy, we are transmitting our DNA as electromagnetic radio waves at an ultra-low frequency all of the time. This paper concludes with the observation: DNA signaling is stimulated by 7 Hz naturally occurring waves on Earth. Waves produced by the human brain are also in the range of 7 Hz. That's 7 oscillations per second. These are interesting questions to be asked and possibly answered. The naturally occurring waves on Earth, the so-called Schumann resonance, has a fundamental frequency of 7.83 Hz, and the alpha brainwaves and the mu rhythm have a bandwidth from about 7.5 to 12.5 Hz. The alpha brainwaves occur when we are in an aware and relaxed state, and the mu rhythm extends across the motor cortex at the back of the head from ear to ear and is responsible for our motor actions. Now, I'm going to come on to why that is quite important, that the mu rhythm is important for our motor actions later on. This is something to be completely different. But they're all classic ultra-low frequency radio waves operating in the same frequency window. For instance, this ambient magnetic field in a research paper oscillating at 7 Hz is emitting ultra-low frequency radio waves at that frequency, and the DNA is basically acting as an antenna and would pick up these radio waves, which would generate an alternating current. And the DNA would be at that precise frequency. So you can send out a radio wave at around about 7 Hz and point it towards something that contains DNA, and it would actually oscillate at the same frequency. Therefore, you would get a bounce back of that signal, but it would contain the DNA. So you could send out a beam of radio waves from anything. You know, if you would create radio waves at 7 Hz, pointed at something that contains DNA, which would be an animal or a plant, and it would respond back by the oscillation at the same 7 Hz, but the radio waves coming back that would be bounced back would contain the DNA. So what it essentially says is Via radio waves, you could read the DNA of anything or anyone at a distance purely by radio waves, and the person or the subject or the object of the target of those radio waves would never know about it. Okay, so let's have a quick look through the conclusion. Again, I'm not going to read all of it, but it's quite important to read the bits I've highlighted. So, conclusion. In this paper, I have attempted to demonstrate that the DNA is both emitting and receiving radio waves. This was originally the discovery of Fritz Albert Popp in the 1970s, who reported a frequency range in the vicinity of visible light and UV light. Since then, the fields of optogenetics and radiogenetics have found that the DNA is also responsive to THF, which is terahertz high frequency, very high frequency infrared radio waves, as well as ultra low frequency radio waves. This being the case, it is inevitable that the DNA is giving off electromagnetic radio waves at the same frequency as the alternating current it is conducting, which is about 7 Hz. It has also been demonstrated in this paper that the brain waves are also in the range of extremely low frequency radio waves, as well as the Schumann resonance, which is the resonance of the Earth, which means that all these electromagnetic waves would be capable of generating an alternating current in the DNA by virtue of the fact that it is a conducting nanowire. Your DNA is really small and it is essentially a wire. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I have just demonstrated there with this one paper, and I'm going to read a couple more as well, is that your DNA acts as a fractal antenna to send and receive on different frequencies, the extremely low frequency of around 7 to 12.5 Hertz, that's oscillations per second, and then the very top end of the terahertz frequency, which is a very high frequency, and I'll show that on the drawing that should be on the screen. And basically, if you send a pulse of radio wave towards your subject, as long as it contains DNA and you hit the right frequency, a signal will bounce back. It will oscillate. A signal will bounce back with an expression of the DNA. So you could read the DNA sequence from a distance, and the only thing that would restrict you, the distance, would be the power of the frequency radio wave you would send out to the subject or the object of target, and it would bounce back. And if you had a receiver yourself, because you would have, because you've got a transmitter, you could then read what the DNA contains from a distance. A distance that wouldn't be infinity, but could be a very long way and would only be limited by the power of the equipment you are using. This next paper, and it will be our last paper we'll actually look at. I know I mentioned we're going to look at two or three more, but this is going to be the last one that we're looking at. This is called On the Function of DNA Magnetism. These are from people who are from the Biophysics Research Institute of San Diego, Localized Therapeutics San Diego, Vaccine Research Institute of San Diego, and the University of California, also in San Diego. All of these are in California in the United States of America. I am just going to sort of very quickly go through this because this is just sort of like a little bit of an add-on to what we've already spoken about how your DNA works as a transmitter. And I'm just going to go through the abstract and a little bit more further down. So, abstract. Although magnetism of DNA in strong fields is well established, it is not commonly considered magnetic in natural weak fields. Since the behaviour of strings of magnetic balls resembles some of the DNA behaviour, such as in replication and transcription, we hypothesize that DNA is magnetic and the DNA strands are magnetised in anti-parallel orientation. We hypothesize that magnetism of DNA is based on ring currents of pi electrons in its bases. We hypothesize that ring currents are fueled by heat, enzymes, or active forms of water. Accordingly, we proposed a helical model of magnetic lines in DNA. We also suggested a new way of how the magnetic field in DNA may oscillate, and that these oscillations will be sequence dependent. We suggest that the collective oscillations of interspersed and periodic repetitive DNA sequences could contribute to magnetic communications between cells and creation of the Gurvich morphogenetic field. We suggest that primary cilium may be an antenna for sending and receiving electromagnetic oscillations by the genome. While experimenting with magnetic balls, we noticed that they prefer shapes familiar from biology. They self-organize in a globule or a string. We also observed other behaviours of magnetic balls which resemble behaviour of DNA during replication, transcription, formation of telomeres loop, ligation and PCR. Also, their behavior resembled the behavior of RNA forming loop structures of growth and disassembly of microtubes and of formation of neural crest and neural tube. Therefore, we hypothesized that DNA, RNA, microtubules, and cells forming neural tube and crest are naturally magnetized. Magnetism of DNA is known to be formed in a very strong magnetic fields around 1 to 16 Tesla via the induction of ring currents in the aromatic pi electron rings of DNA bases, nucleotides, base pairs. Look at this figure for orientation. So, what does all that mean, ladies and gentlemen? I know I just threw a lot of stuff there towards you. Basically, that's a very technical way of saying they've used these magnetic balls to sort of like replicate DNA, to represent it. But really what they're saying is that DNA itself is magnetized, can be magnetized. And some people who know a little bit more about physics or electrics or electronics are already saying, yes, we already knew that. Because when you have an electrical field, you can also create an electromagnet. So you've probably seen these in the movies, on films, on TV and stuff, where you see in the scrapyard, you see this crane with this big thing on the end of it, and it plops down on a car and it picks it up because it's turned the magnet on, and then it goes and drops it into a car crusher, and it turns the electricity off, and that turns the magnet off. And it seems to be as well that your DNA could possibly be a magnet. I don't know how strong that magnet is, probably going to be reasonably weak. But if you have got an electromagnetic field of radio waves, you've got electricity running through all of your body. Therefore, it is a sort of like a follow-on, a sort of like common sense approach that where there's an electrical field, there's also electromagnetism as well. Now, you're probably thinking, right, stop the bus, I want to get off. I've heard everything I need to hear. Or maybe you've heard too much. But what I am going to do, I'm just going to go through what you've heard so far. I'm just going to give you sort of like the highlights, just to remind you, we came from not knowing anything, and this is where we are now. So I'm just going to sort of give you a conclusion. Then after I've done the conclusion, I'm going to hypothesize what I think this actually means in real life. But the conclusion first is, we've gone through all of these different documents and hypotheses and actual published documents from various physics and medical practitioners. In conclusion, what we've said is our bodies use electricity in all of its components to control various parts of our body. We create our own electromagnetic field. We create our own electromagnetic radiation. The cells in our body create their own electromagnetic field. So we generate our own personal force field. Your electromagnetic field works over a number of frequencies, including extremely low frequency and very, very high frequency in the terahertz range. Our brainwaves also work at the extremely low frequency range of about 7 hertz, up to 12.5 hertz. Your genes can be activated or deactivated with both radio waves and or light. Your DNA emits electromagnetic radiation and radio waves. Your DNA also can leave its, and this is the bizarre thing, your DNA can also leave its imprint in water via radio waves without actually touching it. And that's when you put in the nucleotides, etc., back into it, it can also recreate it. So without touching water, you can leave your DNA within that water, and the water will remember it. And that's just mind-blowing to me, because that means you're leaving your DNA anywhere where there's water. And I'm not just talking like a glass of water or a bath of water. I mean, you're walking around the world. You could be walking down the street, in the field, and because unless you live in a very arid desert, there's going to be water everywhere you walk. So you're leaving your DNA as a trail everywhere you go, because you don't have to touch anything. Your DNA is actually left wherever you travel, and that is quite bizarre. So your DNA also absorbs and emits light. Your DNA really is your classic radio transmitter. But there may be other things as well, I think, that might be transmitted via your electromagnetic field. And I think this could include things, because don't forget your brain waves work at the extremely low frequency as well. I think it could also include like your mood that you're currently in, your mindset, your health, maybe your intent as well when you're walking around. The Frequency as well of all of this is around 7 hertz, which means 7 oscillations a second. That's for the extremely low end of the radio spectrum. But don't forget your EMF, your electromagnetic field, is also responsive to very high frequency of the terahertz level, which is very high. And also all of this, all of your radio waves, your electromagnetic field, your electromagnetic radiation that you're pushing out, you're expressing this electromagnetic field, this radio waves as you walk around. They are DNA sequence dependent. You're expressing yourself via electromagnetic radio waves. You're expressing yourself as your DNA and possibly other stuff as well. Now, I'll just let you think about that for a second. You know, we're expressing all of this stuff everywhere. So what does that mean? What does that actually really mean? How does that change your everyday life? Does it change your everyday life? Does it really matter? Am I just talking nonsense here? Well, have a think about this. I'm gonna ask you to have a thought of a couple of examples that you yourself have already experienced. You yourself probably know deep down that you may already know about this, but you don't really know about it. I'll give you an example. Right at the very start of this, I did mention an example of how this could actually work, and the practical example of that is what I mentioned right at the start, where you're thinking or you've got a feeling or somehow you know that somebody is watching you, you're being looked upon, and you turn around and you look straight at that person. And at the start of this journey, you had no idea how that could possibly work, but I think this is how it works. Somebody is watching you. They're projecting their intent via, could be low frequency, could be high frequency, electromagnetic radio waves. They're projecting themselves, their vision, onto you. They're looking at you. They're watching you. And I believe they're expressing their intent. They're broadcasting their intent. And because your DNA is both a receiver and a transmitter, you are somehow receiving their intent. You know they're watching you. You've got a feeling that you're being watched. And I believe they're projecting that via your electromagnetic or via their electromagnetic radiation. They're broadcasting their intent and you're picking it up. And somehow, you're not only are you picking up their intent, you're also aware of where they are in both in space and time. You know where they are because you haven't scanned anywhere. You turn around, you look directly at them. And I think my hypothesis explains how that works. They're expressing their intent. They're broadcasting their intent. They're watching you. They're looking at you. You pick this up. You realise you're being watched. You turn around and you look directly at them. And I think my hypothesis explains how that works. Another good example, have you ever had a situation where you're thinking about someone and they either text you or ring you just after you've been thinking about them, and they just came for no reason, you just started thinking about them, and then within a few minutes or even seconds, the phone rang? I believe it's a similar situation. Somebody is actually thinking about you. They have got intent on communicating with you via whatever method. You're picking that up, and you could be thousands of miles away. You're picking up that intent, and somehow you know, again, they are broadcasting their intent. They're just about to call you or text you or send you an email for some reason, and all of a sudden you're picking that up, and I think it's the same hypothesis. They're broadcasting their intent, or they've got some sort of thought process about you and they're intending to ring you. You pick up on that, and sometimes you pick the phone up and it rings or it beeps in your hand. I think it's that same mechanism. Another question posed by a chap called Steve Isdell. He's a Canadian outdoorsman, and he mentioned, or he asked the question, how do dogs who track people work, bloodhounds or cadaver dogs that find dead bodies, how do they work? Because as far as he's aware, it can't just be scent. It can't just be the scent of the person that they're tracking or the scent of the cadaver, of the dead body underneath the water. Because if these people are lost, the only way you find them, or one of the ways to find them, is by tracking them with tracker dogs. And these are highly skilled animals. And if you want to find a body, it's a cadaver dog can smell a small molecule from miles away. And is it really the smell? Is it scent they're using? Or is it sort of like, do these dogs have an ability, say like a shark, where they can pick up on electromagnetic radiation in electric pulses, and they can they can follow a scent, because again, it's usually something that they've given the original scent from, and then they go and follow that. Is that a case of they're picking up on the DNA or whatever it is you've left behind, where you've expressed it via your radio waves, and they're following the trail you're leaving in the ground as opposed to what they're actually smelling? And it could be both. I mean, it's not something that's either or. It could be both scent and also this trail you're leaving via your DNA expression. And it's also the same with if dogs have been able to find bodies under fast-moving water where any bubbles that were to come up wouldn't come up where the dog was being situated in above the body. It would come out further down the river, any bubbles, because the water's moving so fast, but they find exactly where that body is directly above it. Again, I think that could be something to do with electromagnetic radiation. Either the body is producing that broadcast system, or maybe it's the number of type of bacteria that are doing it. Or again, I don't understand how they're doing it, but I think that might go some way to explain a possible answer. I'm not saying it is the answer, because again, this hypothesis needs to be tested in real world situations. And I think if we could look at the potential of being able to pick up those type of radio waves that people and, well, every living thing is emitting, I think you could actually use this sort of system, this tracing system. It's almost like a human radar for finding people. If you were able to send out a pulse, if somebody has lost at sea, I think you could quite easily find someone via this, or somebody that's lost in one of the national parks around the world. You would be able to find a human, not necessarily a specific type of person, because if you're scanning hundreds of square miles of forest, you're looking for a person. They're of a certain age, certain height, a certain type of person, certain ethnicity. You could stick that in your search equipment, send out the pulse, see what comes back, and you go, oh, that person is over here 15 miles away. It might be that exact. But again, this is just a hypothesis. It does need some real world evaluation. But I think this also goes into other things as well, because of the fact that optogenetics and radiogenetics, which is both light and radio wave geneticism, you can switch genes on or off via both radio waves and or light. So are you able to either track somebody? I think the answer is yes. And find somebody? I think the answer is yes, via radio waves. Are you able to change somebody's genetic makeup via this mechanism as well? That's also a question, because if your body responds to light and radio waves, and you can switch genes on or off, are we in danger of any sort of malfeasance where people want to turn your genes off or on via a radio wave, and you would never know anything about it? You wouldn't know if a certain gene had been switched on or off. Interesting thought. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the interwebs, I think I'm going to have to call it a day there. It's gone on for well over 45 minutes. I mean, I was hoping this would be a 20-minute episode, but unfortunately it's cracking on for a good 50 minutes. There's lots of stuff I haven't really touched yet. I mean, there's lots of subjects into this which hang off the back of this hypothesis. And I'll give you a couple of examples as well, such as when people have experiences with UFOs, sometimes they talk about being frozen to the spot. A beam of light hit them and then they couldn't move. They could breathe, they could move their eyes, but they couldn't actually move their bodies in any way, shape or form. And I think, again, it's that would be optogenetics. A beam of light at a certain frequency, certain intensity and power could actually stop you from moving. And another example is being affected by other electromagnetic radiation from other elements, from utilities, from Wi-Fi, from radio waves, from power lines, from 3G, 4G, 5G. I think the hypothesis stands quite well against the premise that people and animals actually can be affected by either light or by some sort of radio waves. It could be television, could be radio, could be 2, 3, 4, 5G, 6G's coming out. It could be the frequency, it could be the power, the intensity of it could be an issue. I mean, I'm a beekeeper, and I have heard and read of many instances where whole colonies have died, and it could be either light in an urban environment or radio waves from an antenna. And that's not necessarily just saying it's cellular technology, it could be radio or TV antennas as well. So I think my hypothesis states that that could actually be a thing. And I know this is very much a contentious issue around 2, 3, 4, 5G influencing people and harming people via radiation, magnetic radiation. But I believe that, I mean, I didn't believe it beforehand. I mean, I knew somebody who was actually affected by electromagnetic radiation, and they had very much a negative effect. Now, if they ever came into a high intensity level of electromagnetic radiation, they would be violently ill for at least a day, sometimes 2 or 3 days, like really knocked out by this electromagnetic radiation. So it had a physical effect. You couldn't see it, you couldn't taste it, you couldn't touch it, but you could actually feel it, or she could actually feel it. So that is also something I'm going to look into. I know there's a big thing at the moment where people are saying it does and it doesn't. 5G doesn't affect people. Well, if my hypothesis stands true, and I believe it does, then any electromagnetic radiation has the potential, either in a positive or a negative way, to affect an animal or a plant or people, either positively or negatively. So that's something else I'm going to look to in the future. If you've listened this far, I'd just like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the interweb, for sticking with it. It's been quite a journey. It's been quite a discovery. It's been a hell of an eye-opener for me. I've spent weeks and weeks researching this, and it's definitely been a journey of discovery to find out that we, as essentially electric beings, are broadcasting our DNA, possibly our intent, our mood, our health, and possibly many other things, just as we walk around this planet and live our lives. And hopefully it's answered a few questions. It's raised far more questions for me. If this is a hypothesis that can be proven to be true, and I'm fairly confident it's a pretty good hypothesis, then the ramifications of this are quite extensive. But again, I'll be touching on this in future episodes. But thanks very much for your time, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully we've all learned something, we've all grown a bit, and I'll see you on the next one. See you later.